So hi everyone, thanks for joining us. So we are here today to talk about Rose English. I'm Amy TOBIN, I'm a lecturer in History of Art at the University of Cambridge and a curator at Kettle's Yard. And I'm joined with Cora GILROY-WARE.
Hi, I'm Cora GILROY-WARE and I am an artist and a scholar. I'm currently a lecturer at the University of York in the History of Art department, soon to be an associate professor in History of Art at the University of Oxford.
And we're really happy to be talking about Rose's work together on the occasion of her new online exhibition at Richard Saltoun, Part 2, The Pioneers, which is one in a series of shows that celebrates the work of the extraordinary British art critic and curator Guy Brett, who passed away earlier this year. So we're going to kick off really by talking through Rose's work, and we're going to probably range around her career a bit and pick up on some of the themes that Guy explored in his book-length essay on Rose's work that came out, gosh, I don't even know the year, but called Abstract Vaudeville, and it's published by Riding House. And that title is a title that speaks to the complexity of Rose's work and its ability to, in Guy's words, join two unlikes enough to bring about a chain of reflection. So on that, maybe we can use that to kick off our conversation.
Yeah, so I have to confess, and we spoke about this a little bit in preparation for this conversation, that I'm a huge fan of Rose's works, and actually I've avoided writing about them at any great length in the past because I have such a kind of visceral and bodily emotional response to them, and we can go into detail about which ones in particular, that I haven't wanted to intellectualize that response or kind of try to put it into words. I feel something very profound when I look at the documentation of Rose's works and some of the photographs which kind of blur the line between documentation and sort of a work of art in its own right. So I'm a huge fan. This is a kind of experiment for me in verbalizing some of the feelings and thoughts and things that come up for me when I view her work. Literally, to be completely honest, when I look at particularly some of the early works, even Bed and Field, 1971, a divertissement, the studies for that series and the documentation of it, of the performance, the Baroque Harriet and Baroque Ruby series, 1973, I look at them and then I go out into the world and I feel more comfortable in my own skin. And that's not a kind of exaggeration. That's really how I feel about her work, which is testament, I think, to the power of Rose's practice, that one can feel that way when dealing with images. So I can look at these images and not necessarily at sort of films of the performances, or I can look at the documentation and this sort of ephemera around her work and still feel that kind of very deep reaction. So I'm excited to talk about her work and to intellectualize it, or try to intellectualize it, but I should say I've deliberately held off doing that in the past.
Well, there's always so much pleasure to be had in Rose's work, I think, and that's one of the things that's so wonderful about it. And one of the ways that there's unlikely things joined, it's pleasure with immense intellectual quality and quantity in different ways. So one of the things that we wanted to talk about was Englishness or Britishness, and that's also a place that Guy starts his essay about Rose's work, noting, you know, that her name, Rose English, having this kind of irony about it. But it's also very much there in the work and in the early work in particular.
Yeah, so I was interested, so let's just, let's talk about Quadrille firstly, 1975, kind of a very iconic work by Rose that I feel that perhaps has been one of the things that people, one of the series that people associate with her the most. I got the sense from looking at that that her status as an outsider to a certain version of rural England was coming through, that she was looking at a particular class milieu and a particular kind of nationalistic, inherently white supremacist, emphatically colonial, even in a post-colonial context, looking at that world from a distance and deconstructing it, reassembling it in a kind of fragmentary form. And so quadrille is interesting because I've read that she originally wanted to stage it at the Spanish writing school in Vienna. So not actually in England, she wanted to stage it elsewhere. And I think that's interesting for all sorts of reasons, the sort of Baroque undertones to her work as well, which sort of continue throughout her work, her oeuvre. But I think that there's something so perfect about how in the end, it was Southampton riding, the Southampton horse show. And so it kind of right in the middle of a certain kind of Middle England that the work is not critiquing necessarily in a direct way, but engaging with, and as I say, sort of interrupting and deconstructing, only to sort of reassemble in this very distanced way. And so I'm interested in viewing a kind of particular kind of, I wouldn't go as far necessarily as to say that work is decolonial, but thinking about the relationship between the British Empire and horse culture. So like the word gymkhana, for example, is the sort of very elite colonial clubs frequented by kind of segregated and frequented only by Europeans in India, but it's also like the horse equestrian shows, the gymkhana as an equestrian show, jodhpurs being a word that arises from imperial India, polo being a game that emerges in the context of the British Empire. And they sort of, even in divertissement, there's a sort of clinking of the china, almost a sort of polite society, tea drinking English world. And I'm actually reading a novel right now with a character that just reminds me so much of Rose's works. It's Burmese Days by George Orwell, and it's written in I think the 30s. It's sort of decay of the British Empire in present day Myanmar and Burma. And one of the characters, Elizabeth, has sort of gone to this fancy boarding school and kind of been in the crowd with a sort of right honorable so-and-so, and then her family lost their fortune, so she's kind of constantly longing for this world of horses and of hunting. And I think just the way that Rose engages with that is so genius, because it's not a straightforward critique, but it's something that kind of acknowledges the more sort of seductive aspects of that culture, but also it's a critique, I think, of the more sort of it's really about class, I think.
Yeah, and it's an interesting work because I think, you know, it's often been read or positioned as like a feminist performance, right? And it can definitely be read in those terms, but it's more complicated really than just being about gender and the spectacle of gender, although that's an important part of it. And for me, yeah, the first time I saw it, it really spoke to experiences that I've had, you know, or there's a kind of, there's sets of vocabularies in the work that really are quite contradictory. So yes, there's this kind of horsey culture on the one hand, but then also the tabards that they wear are just speak to me of, you know, working class restaurants, or the sort of house coats that working class women wear and that are familiar to me from my childhood. And I suppose there's ways in which the costuming balances those contradictions in the same way that it also like creates these like hybrid horse girls, right, that speaks to ideas of breeding, right, which I think is in line with some of what you're saying, and also breeding of horses, which has in turn colonial connotations, and connotations around trade that stretch right back into the 17th century. So yeah, so I think it's a really interesting work that, you know, to use the phrase intersectionality, that actually does kind of balance an intersection of forces, not just around gender and class and the colonial world or the kind of remainders of a colonial world, but also sexuality, and I often think of this idea of like choreography, you know, speaking to the sort of social choreography of heteronormativity, and how it sort of lets it roll out, but disturbed by these kind of horse hooves and swinging tails.
Well, dance as an art form is so central to this sort of codification and performance of gender difference and of the gender binary as well.
Yeah, and I mean, that's absolutely also the other vocabulary that's often animating Rose's work at this time. And you mentioned a divertissement, which of course, you know, includes the point shoes and the ballet dancers along with the china. And then, you know, in lots of the works around the 70s, you have point shoes and horsehair and all kinds of things kind of overlapping.
I think it's interesting to consider the point shoe and the horse and sort of what they have in common, because I think both, the point shoe is almost a very fitting metaphor. You've got this kind of dedication to beauty at the expense of one's health. So the sort of forcing of the body into this kind of unnatural shape in the name of beauty, with this kind of, again, implicit femininity. And it's interesting, the horse as well, the kind of dressage culture around the horse, and the beauty of the horse's mane, the grooming, the different varieties of horse, and the sort of way in which they're kind of can be ranked according to their beauty, but also this incredible power. And it's interesting, the horse doesn't know its own, you know, that actually when a horse is coming towards you, you can feel a bit sort of scared, but actually the horse doesn't know how big it is. But there's a kind of, and in the association between the horse and war. And so I'm fascinated in Rose's works in the same way that abstract vaudeville as a concept is a sort of marriage of opposites, that actually there's this kind of the delicacy and the violence, or the delicacy and the brutality or the force, I think, or the strength are always kind of brought into a very interesting dialogue, or kind of counterbalanced, played off one another.
Yeah, and I think there's also a connection between like adolescent girls, right, and ballet and horses, and this kind of maybe also like a realm of fantasy that I mean, there was a work that I found when I first started kind of doing my research on feminist art in the 70s, which was a work by Rose that was in Sweet 16 and Never Been Shown, from the Country Life series. And I've always been fascinated by this title of this exhibition, Sweet 16 and Never Been Shown, which speaks to the idea that these women artists had never had the opportunity to exhibit their work. Also speaks to this kind of girlishness, you know, in it, that I always found very intriguing in relation to Rose's work, because it doesn't linger in that space of like perceived vulnerability or lack. It's very much, as you say, kind of, there's a force in it or a strength in it. And I think that's what her work often actually brings out, you know, by combining the ballet shoe and the horse, is this kind of idea of like a powerful girl.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's not this kind of searing indictment of femininity, you know, which I imagine, I mean, now this is I think one of the reasons why Rose's work is so mobile and is so resonant now, that actually we're very familiar with this, you know, kind of girl boss mentality of this kind of weaponized femininity that's become totally cliche. But actually at that point, to embrace the feminine, or sort of reveal it for its complexity, shine a light on it, or deconstruct and reassemble it without sacrificing any of its delicacy and its beauty and its seductive nature, I think is just so radical, and so has been particularly inspiring for me actually in my own artistic work. I thought it was interesting. I read that when when documentation of her work was shown at the Women's Free Art Alliance in London in 1975, a writer in The Guardian described it as the country life type girls, like an indictment of the country life type girls' horsey obsessions, which is just, to me, completely misses the point. That actually the work is so far from a straightforward critique, or saying, oh, you know, this culture needs to be kind of, you know, that actually it's something about it kind of almost elevates it to a sort of religious, there's something about the country life, the display of the covers in that kind of quasi-religious way with the shrine-like, and I suppose it would be hard to sort of say exactly what that work is doing. Obviously there's the stuff about breeding, and it's obviously an implicitly feminist work, but I think it's doing a lot more than critiquing what it kind of, its elements, and I think that brings us to one of the distinctive aspects of Rose's feminist practice, is that it leaves a lot unresolved, exists in our time as a deeply inspiring and meaningful version of feminism. And I imagine at that time, and perhaps you can talk more about this, but even thinking about Berlin and her collaboration with Sally Potter, from what I've read, that Rose was aware that there was a different kind of tenor to that particular piece than to other forms of feminist art that were happening at that time, that were more propagandistic or more overtly critical and more overtly kind of, or more political with a capital P. But actually, when you look at some of that work, perhaps it's so rooted in the 70s. Whereas I think with Rose's work, it could be, you know, for other reasons that are not to do with the work itself, couldn't happen now, but also you can imagine that kind of imagery resonating now, and it does resonate now.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's a degree to which I think she's often kind of staging things rather than giving us an opinion to have or politics to share. And I think partly that's maybe, or the way that her work doesn't fit with other feminist tendencies at that moment, is it's really not about identity or trying to articulate an identity in a particular way. As we've kind of already been sketching, I think she's very alive to context and to the way that people are formed or forged, and the kind of push and pull of the social and the self, you know, the social. And so I think her work does that, or stages these moments in very compelling ways. But yeah, to speak to the collaborations with Sally Potter and Jackie Lansley, and then with Lynn McRitchie and others, you know, their group kind of ebbs and flows in size and scale. I think that what they hit upon is this idea of like interdisciplinarity. So Rose as a visual artist coming together with Sally as then a musician, but also obviously being interested in literature and opera and film.
And a dancer as well.
And Jackie, Sally was a dancer, and Jackie also being a choreographer. So the sense of what they could each kind of bring to the table, but then also how each one of them could also push and pull at the specialisms of the others, if that makes some sense, and to kind of open all of these things out as a kind of text that could be rewritten or rerouted. And I think a lot of the works like Berlin, like Thriller, like Death and the Maiden, are kind of interventions in very well-known stories or narrative forms. And I think that what's very interesting about it is it's not intervention for critique's sake, but a kind of opening up, so that then all of the other meanings that file out of that intervention have these significant changes, or they prompt resignification, so like the mythic or the generic, all of those things are kind of forced to change. And often that did turn around gender, but I think they were also very alive to issues of race and sexuality as well. And you can see how that plays out in the people that they work with, or the stories that they tell in Gold Diggers and in Thriller.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about the idea of liberation, I suppose, in relation to that particular brand of feminism. I don't have an answer for the extent to which that work has a kind of an emancipatory impulse behind it. But if it does, that's kind of masked and abstracted in a way that is particularly, again, successful, in the sense that it's aware of the kind of in the blocks and the kind of you know, that it's kind of working within a particularly ever sort of decreasing or an ever more restricted framework. You know, we were talking about Thatcherism and the sort of disguised forms of fascism that were, you know, that constituted the political situation in England at that time. Obviously, you had the National Front, you had, you know, this sort of increasing privatization of experience. I think Rose talks about the privatization of the soul. I think there's something about the joyful, the sort of dedication to joy and to beauty, but to joy and to happiness and to the heart as a sort of center of one's experience that I think is so clearly, you know, and then it's so clearly a response to the political situation in England at that time, and that also speaks to our situation now, where that process of privatization, of flattening, has become total, to the point where when I read these accounts of Rose's works throughout the 80s into the 90s, I'm struck with just a sense of loss and of longing, that kind of space that she created and that she designed is not possible now. Maybe it will be in the future, but or maybe there will be new forms that you know, emerge from the rubble of what's been kind of destroyed and flattened. But I definitely feel a kind of longing when I read about some of those performances.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the interesting things about Rose's work and Rose's collaborative works is that often they're not really understood fully at the time that they're made, or
like all great artists.
Like all great artists, yeah. And I always remember a review of The Gold Diggers, which was profoundly negative, and just how crazy that seems to me, because it's such an intelligent and beautiful film. But you know, I think it is about this, there's something itinerant in her combination of pleasure and politics. And I think, you know, it's never politics with a capital P, but that there is something there that is important. And I think one of the ways that I was thinking about her work recently was the sense in which, like, actually just like the arts is very central to it. So it's interesting that you say, like, you feel like it's not possible, or like it's all flattened out now. And in a material sense, I agree. You know, we talked before about how difficult it would be to stage a work in a swimming pool and an ice rink. But in another sense, you know, that because the works talk to these kind of themes of representation, or like heroic narrative, or Death and the Maiden, about, you know, the way that women die, when female characters die in narrative arcs, and how to kind of push against that inevitable death, or like fallibility and infallibility in her later performances, and you know, how those things are actually, they translate, right? Because there is a sense of kind of recognition, and we can always kind of maybe find a foothold in a sense in her work in that way, where, you know, contemporaries of Rose's in the 70s were much more materialists. You know, they wanted to make work around current affairs and events at the moment, and political campaigns and other things, and that work is wonderful and important, but it's very different to the sort of affect and the communicability that, you know, that Rose's work has in it.
How does that speak then to her kind of use of physical objects and props? I mean, it's interesting because the sort of interdisciplinary nature of her practice is, you know, described as theatre, circus, poetry, music, song, installation, poetry, but also the sculptural element is something that's particularly interesting to me. I mean, her sort of early, you know, the work at Leeds Polytechnic when she was a student, I was really interested to hear her talk about how that was a very radical place, particularly radical art school at that time, because the teachers were really committed to a certain kind of practical interdisciplinarity, which seems just very unusual and foreign now, which is interesting, because it would have been incredibly progressive then. But there's obviously the ceramic pieces, which are incredible, and the way in which they sort of toe the line between you know, useful objects and things that one might hang on the wall, but the fact that they then get used in performances charges them with meaning, and with this different kind of energy as well. So when I just love the idea that she was studying ceramics in order to make works for her tableaus and her performances. You know, Plato's chair using the column and the sort of to indicate the void. And I was actually thinking, speaking of Plato's chair, I was reading book 10 of the Republic, and I was thinking of Rose when Plato talks about, or Socrates talks about, the kind of the bed made by the craftsman, not the chair, the bed. How there's the idea of the bed, which is invented by God, exists in the realm of God. There's the bed made by the craftsman, and then there's the representation of the bed made by the artist. And actually, it's really interesting because it kind of seems like a real defense of craft as opposed to art, which goes against the kind of Renaissance, you know, elevation of art in relation to craft. But it's interesting that I feel like Rose's work inhabits the space of the idea, the space of the craft, and then the space of the sort of representation as well. So I thought just even the title Plato's Chair, I know it came to her in a dream, but it seems like a very intentional kind of way to acknowledge that fluidity and that interdisciplinarity.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something very interesting in the way that nothing settles in Rose's work. So yeah, the ceramics that are used in a performance or staged as an installation or a tableau, and how then there's a kind of temporality to those objects that kind of changes their relationship to objecthood. And then, you know, to add on that, the sense, you know, that they're worn or placed on the body and photographed on bodies, and you know, some of the ceramic objects are cache sex, right? This idea of something that covers or you know, preserves, right, but at the same time titillates. And it's always this kind of threshold, or like the ice rink and the swimming pool and the fires in the house in Berlin, those three elemental stages, you know, a sort of idea of transformation that I think speaks again to the proscenium arch, of the theatrical works, or the columns that frame Plato's chair, these kind of pointing to the edges or the margins, these kind of moments of being in the fantasy but also seeing the edges of it.
Yeah, and that sense of fantasy versus the edge kind of speaks to as well this sort of there's the kind of immense beauty of Rose's works, and like I said, the sort of the way they speak to the heart, but also that sense of, you know, I think Guy Brett speaks about this feelings of happiness that you'd have, you know, on a Friday night or whatever, just to be in the audience of one of Rose's performances. But I think that when we focus so much on the kind of the pleasure of it, we can sort of perhaps overlook the incredible risk and almost maybe danger as well that went along with her practice, that again is somewhat, I think, foreign to us now in our particular point in time and our place. Even thinking about squatting and the sort of accounts of Rose kind of climbing in and, you know, them occupying these buildings. And I heard that Sally Potter was in jail and that Rose like worked as part of her like legal counsel. Even Rose going to abattoirs and getting these, you know, bits of animal and creating these incredible costumes, sculptural costumes out of them. That the edge comes through, not just in the finished work itself, but in the very nature of the practice itself, and the risks and the danger, you know, that there's a kind of intensity to it that I think is an important part of the work itself, to the process.
Yeah, I think so. And yeah, and sometimes, I mean, I always think with the horse shoes, like there's an element of kind of abjection, right? You know, this kind of sense of a foot that is buried so that only the hoof remains, and then wearing those, and how I always feel about how they must have felt to wear them, and that precarity kind of also speaks, I think, to some of the precarity of having to constantly then move those objects, you know, and carry these props with you. And I think that's interesting, you know, I never really thought about how then so many of Rose's performances involve bringing props to the stage and using them, you know, and kind of making that sense of taking something out of a chest and animating it and using it, you know, that is quite central to many of the performances.
Yeah, and the courage of just turning up. I mean, like, remember reading about her just turning up in New York with a bag full of props.
Yeah.
You know, that I just think that's something just so inspiring, and kind of that precarity and that kind of the turning of precarity into beauty, I just think is incredibly inspiring and unusual. I don't know if there's any other artists from that particular time that you can sort of trace that same spirit in.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of artists who are sort of using performance as this newly open space, you know, where such things could be possible. And definitely, you know, for some artists, chance was incredibly important, and for others, the idea of theatricality was crucial. And many artists at the time are kind of using like the tension of liveness, I suppose. But of course, there's also these debates, very critical debates, where, you know, particularly for artists who appear to be women or cis women, you know, they are critiqued at times for their sort of femininity or their beauty, and kind of putting that on display as a kind of spectacle. And even though those critiques in some ways are not personal, like they feel personal because it's the body of the artist is in the work. And I mean, I don't know if Rose was subject to any of those critiques, actually, but I know that Sally Potter wrote a very famous and brilliant article on shows which kind of contends with some of those ideas about passivity. And Rose's work in practice absolutely pushes against that. And I think what's super interesting about is it called Adventure or Revenge, the work that she made in New York, where she has all of these props and improvises a monologue, is that she almost kind of performs like the theory of performativity, you know, 10 years before it's written and published, and this idea of acts and how props and other things augment our appearance in the world. And I think that's really interesting that she would do that sort of on the cuff, so to speak. I mean, that's, and that also that it doesn't remain, like we don't have a script for that performance. I think that's a very interesting an interesting thing. And so yeah, I've been thinking a lot recently about this turn to pushing and pulling femininity and the performance of femininity, and in Rose's work and her contemporaries, who many of whom kind of experimented with that, including Martha Wilson, who ran Franklin Furnace, where the New York performance happened. And very interested in how those different you know, there's that desire to kind of to break down a gender binary kind of those artists.
Yeah, it's really interesting how Rose uses the figure of the showgirl to explore some of this terrain. And so you have this kind of hyper feminine, hyper objectified, hyper visible figure who's typically scantily clad and also silent, whose body moves, but who's not a kind of you know, active sort of, you know, is dehumanized essentially by the guise in which they appear. And I was really struck by reading something that she spoke about, by sort of, there was something so powerful about allowing the ornament to speak. And I thought that's so, again, so kind of relevant to our time, where I feel like, I don't know if these issues will ever be resolved around the kind of effects of objectification on well-being and one's sort of sense of belonging and being in the world, versus the kind of pleasures of femininity and the kind of ways in which femininity can be a tool of survival as well, particularly for trans women. So it's really interesting the way that she explores these ideas, and not in a didactic way, but in a way to kind of highlight their complexity and their incapacity to perhaps ever be fully resolved, as long as we're in this, you know, particular you know, that I think that she highlights the fact that, and I like the idea of there being this kind of, she talks actually about resolution itself, in the sense of, with new technologies, new sort of cinematic technologies or documenting technologies, new cameras, everything's constantly striving towards resolution, higher res, high definition. But actually what is being resolved, what's being defined, you know, that actually as we acquire these more and more sophisticated and more kind of exacting forms of documentation, what we're actually documenting becomes more and more obscure and difficult to kind of grapple with and describe. So very, yeah, love it, love Rose.
Yeah. I mean, one of the other things I really like about her work is because I'm also 6 foot tall, Rose is 6 foot tall, and so I always have this kind of tall person affinity to it, because, you know, it's sometimes one can feel uncomfortable like occupying femininity, right, if you don't always appear to be super feminine. But I think one thing when I saw her work, I was like, oh, you know, I too can wear enormous false eyelashes and and feathers.
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of my tall friends, I have a few tall friends, and they've also spoken about that sense in which their height kind of feel is sort of like, what's the feminine version of emasculate? I feel like there isn't one. Defeminize them. But at the same time, obviously, for me, as someone who's on the short end of the spectrum, you know, that to me, the sort of model, the tall fashion model, you know, that to me is the ultimate form of femininity. So I suppose as women, we're constantly feeling like what we've been dealt makes us less than, you know, which makes femininity even all the more fascinating terrain to explore as an artist.
Yeah, I agree very much. Yeah, and I think that's also there in or I really enjoy how Rose stages femininity and also relationships between women in her photographs. We talked a bit before about how photography relates to performances as well, and maybe we can reflect a bit on the role that photography plays in her practice.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose we're looking at these images, especially, I think it's important to note that this exhibition is an online exhibition. And again, it's testament to the power of the work that its impact is still felt in the form of an image on a screen. One doesn't have to see, and like with the pandemic, there's been a lot of reflection on my part, but also with my students, about what it means to experience a work, not only through reproduction, but virtually, and whether or not we can really know a work of art when we're experiencing it in this mediated form. But I think with the photographs of Rose's works, the performances, it transcends documentation to the point where it could risk losing its impact that when experienced on the screen or you know, in a print or whatever. But actually it has I think the ways in which it's not actually documentation. And I think with a divertissement, it was actually, from what I gather, the tableau, they sort of were the ground from which the performances then grew, rather than being documentation of the performances. And so the documentation or the images from the performances are actually just as important as the end product itself, which is perhaps why that early work is so resonant, in a way that when I see documentation of the later work, I feel loss and longing, and I feel regret that I wasn't around to have experienced it. But when I see the images of the early work, I feel that I was there. I feel like I am there. I feel like I am one of those women. So I suppose, yeah, it's fascinating the way in which the documentation or the imagery is, the still imagery is folded into, you know, it's the residue of the work itself, but it's also the absolute primary substance of it as well.
Yeah, and I mean, I love that about a divertissement, that the photographs structure the attitudes of the performance and kind of help choreograph it, and I think, you know, A Baby Boy, A Mere Glimpse, that work, and the way that photography documents it, but also the photographs that are alongside it,
Yeah,
are very fascinating, in the sense that the photographs seem to knit these various mise en scène together, or moments or characters. Like, I mean, there's that wonderful picture of Rose wearing wings in a glade with this kind of horse made
Pegasus,
yeah. And I love that image. And then there's another one with Rose and her sister Athene, and I think Athena was, is connected to Pegasus, right? And there's these kind of stories that weave in those images that to me seem to create this kind of world. And that wonderful work with the plait, that the scissors approach the plait across a series of photographs, where you see there the photography, staging the temporality of the performance. It's I mean, I just think it's very intriguing, playful, also kind of intimidating, or scary in some sense. The tension that is built up in those images, and then later on the way she uses photography as a performance for the camera rather than a performance for an audience. I think there's a lot of complexity in that that's very interesting, as you say, when we're kind of meeting these works online.
Yeah, and I feel like you can never you can never kind of state enough these days, and we've all got cameras in our pockets on our phones, just that each of those images would have to have been developed. And the craft of photography is something that as much as there are people that obviously still practice it, I've been trying to find a way of learning this particular photographic technique, and it's just a historic process, and I've tried to sort of build my own darkroom at home, but for a while before the pandemic I was looking for a way to learn it, and so many places that formerly taught photography proper in its original way, like SLR classes, and it's just like, I don't need an SLR. Like, I respect, I have an SLR, and I respect there's lots to be learned about lighting and things like that, but just the fact that these photographs are works of craft, and they're works of art, and they're documentation, and they speak to a kind of earlier history of photography as well, in the sense that they kind of, I think, are very much linked to the tradition of the tableau vivant and to pictorial photography, and the ways in which photography itself, when it first kind of came on the scene as an art form, was really like, now we can see reality in a new way. This is what, and then artists began to say, well, actually, what if we try to do what we do with painting, but with the camera? Is that possible? And it was a kind of failed art form that perhaps lives on in its own way through kind of fashion photography and the sort of pictorializing that goes on in that world, kind of commodified version of it. But actually pictorial photography, when you're sort of staging mythological scenes before the camera, didn't take on, because there were always, painting had a lot to kind of, painting was developing in its own way as the camera kind of, so it's fascinating the role that photography plays, and how, there's a kind of ghost of Emma Hamilton is haunting some of those images from a divertissement, and Tessa pregnant with Joseph as well, which is going to be in this exhibition from 1974. Very haunting, as you say. Again, speaks to that kind of edge, the beauty and the pain of the point shoe, the kind of the double edge and the edge.
Yeah, I mean, I love the image of the kind of pregnant figure, which is such a kind of temporally specific, way of experiencing one's body, right? You can almost kind of understand, you can pinpoint the point in time because of the way the body changes so quickly, and then the way that these horse models kind of surround the figure as if they're crowding her out, that that they're just static, but because there's something in, in the way the sun falls across the floor, that this idea of movement and change and time is filling that image up, right? And then there's also these kind of impossibilities of it, and the kind of strangeness in it that I think is really surprising and haunting. But it's sort of, it's a very it's very interesting to kind of think about that in relation to the performance work, and how this work precedes a lot of the performances that come later.
Yeah, I'm fascinated, actually. The kind of arc of her career is so interesting. I suppose the Pegasus, I mean, she talks about entering her own work at a very particular point in time, and how she liked to direct and kind of view from afar, from behind the camera, as it were, and then eventually kind of enters her own work at a particular point in time. And I feel that the Pegasus photos such a beautiful kind of self-portrait, as well as, you know, I think there was something particular about using her own body in that work that seems like perhaps part of that turning point to when she then takes center stage as a performer.
And then she doesn't begin to speak in the performances until 81, I think, until the Adventure or Revenge work in New York. Prior to that, those performances in Berlin and Rabies, which is at the Roundhouse, I think, where she was silent in them, while others sometimes spoke. Although the other thing that's that I love about Berlin is the silent male chorus, and then how that's picked up again later in Walks on Water, where you have this constantly interrupting, annoying chorus who play off against Rose's kind of solo player.
Yeah, the muteness of the early performances, or the sort of reliance on music and non-verbal sound, is fascinating, because those works really seem to sing, or they seem to say a lot, even if what they're saying cannot be sort of translated back into our language. And again, the kind of ways in which she then comes to embrace language later on in the sort of 80s, and like we said, that sort of sense of the ornament speaking, which I think is so powerful about her work. The chorus does sound hilarious. I just wish I could have been there to see this all-male chorus. This is dressed as trees in Walk on Water.
Yeah, and they're also like a Jerome garb, you know.
Yeah.
Painting. And I mean, I do also really appreciate the way that she kind of constantly remakes these dynamics from the history of art, but also cinema and musicals, and just this kind of sense of flipping it or switching it. And I guess the role of the dialogue in that.
Because it's not as just as straightforward. I mean, there's obviously artists do that a lot. You know, the sort of history of art is really kind of based on those sorts of interventions, whether it's a more straightforward emulation or whether it's an interruption, you know, of some other kind. But I think one of my favorites is the Miss O'Murphy, the kind of restaging of the Francois Boucher painting, and she sort of has drawn over the surface of the picture. But I like it because it's not as simple as kind of inserting, her reframing and her recasting of those particular works, whether it's the Géron painting or the Boucher, is so, again, elliptical, open-ended, raises more questions than it answers, but somehow that ends up being so much more satisfying politically than if it was just to kind of rip it up and put something else in, and
and it's also, I mean, one of the really interesting things about that is you can read that through a kind of, feminist mimesis or parody argument, but there's always something else happening in Rose's work. And I think that actually goes back to, in a way, the kind of vaudevillian vocabulary that she employs often, because with Walks on Water, like the figures of the chorus, all of their costumes are kind of camp, and they're they sort of look profoundly costumed until then they sort of, I think it's at that performance where they march off stage in their own clothes and she has to call them back. All of these transformations and alterations that are not just transformations on their own terms or the terms of the historical object, but in this kind of couched in this kind of these other vocabularies.
It's a generosity as well towards the things that she's engaging with, somehow allowing things to be received on their own terms, but also entirely transformed. But in honor of Rose, I'm drinking my water out of my ceramic horse mug. Is it a prop? Is it something else? I don't know, but this is a tribute to Rose. So
cool. I feel like we all need a horse prop. I would really like one of the belts with the.
Yes, I know. I would wear it. Like the shoes for me. I think I just want to try them on and just see how incredible.
That's one of the things that's also quite haptic, Rose's work. I mean, I remember what she showed me, the eyelashes. the box.
Incredible.
Then imagining wearing them and how heavy it must be to kind of blink with these enormous,
almost touching the audience.
Yeah.
And the eyelash as well, it's really interesting. It's like the wing and the hearts, the wings, the eyelashes, the tiara, you know, these things are somehow amplified in order to give them a strength that they wouldn't possess otherwise. And I think even just the idea of a lash, the eyelash, but also the whiplash, you know, encompasses that kind of tension, or that those opposites again, that she's marrying the opposites in this very kind of yeah, it's not extreme, it's extreme in its own way, in the way that it brings things together, but it's not particularly extreme in either direction. And I think that's one of the things that I love about it the most.
Yes, well, I mean, maybe that's a good place to finish our conversation, lusting after Rose's props. But yeah, it's been a real pleasure to speak with you, Cora, and to revel in Rose's work.
Likewise, thank you, Amy.